Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third keynote from the Computational Neuroscience meeting. I'm Julie Haas. I'm one of the program committee members, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Danielle Bassett. Dr. Bassett is the J. Peter Skirkinich Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She has appointments in bioengineering, physics, astronomy, electrical and systems engineering, neurology, and psychiatry, as well as a position at the Santa Fe Institute. She earned her PhD and a postgrad certificate in physics at the Cavendish Lab at the U of Cambridge, and then did a postdoc and a stint as a SAGE Junior Research Fellow at the UC Santa Barbara before establishing her own lab at Penn. Her work searches for simple rules that govern the brain's tangled networks. It spans a number of disciplines, applying complex systems and graph theory to classical physics problems and to neural representations, brain psychopathologies, the C. elegans connectome, epilepsy, fMRI, and academic citation networks. Her CV listed 23 papers in prep, 45 papers submitted, and 312 published, and a book since opening her lab in 2013. Her awards include a Winston Churchill Scholarship, a Fulbright Award. She was the youngest person to be awarded a MacArthur and a Sloan Fellowship. She's also received a Sloan Fellowship. She has research fellowships from the Annenberg Public Policy Center and has won the Lagrange Prize in Complex System and the Erdos-Renyi Prize. Most recently, she's turned her attention to applying control systems theory to the brain, and I think that's what she'll tell us about today. So that said, here she is.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. Okay. Everything look okay from your side?
Yeah, I think I just need to focus it. There we go.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this meeting. I'm really excited about the sort of content space of this meeting, and also the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we've been thinking about in terms of advances in computational psychiatry. What I will be focusing on today is understanding cognitive control, specifically about executive function more broadly, as a network process, and why that becomes important and relevant when we think about efforts in computational psychiatry. So first, I want to ask the question of why. So why study cognitive control? I am particularly interested in this space because deficits in cognitive control specifically, but also executive function more broadly, accompany many psychiatric conditions. And just to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the terms that I'm going to be using throughout the talk, I'm going to define cognitive control as the process by which goals and plans influence behavior. And I will use the phrase executive functions as meaning a set of cognitive processes that are necessary for the cognitive control of behavior, selecting and successfully monitoring behaviors that facilitate the attainment of chosen goals. Some common examples of these executive functions include task switching, working memory, decision-making, and inhibiting inappropriate behavior. And when I think about cognitive control specifically, but also executive function more broadly, I think that a common theme, a common process that is engaged is the careful control of state transitions. So let me give you three simple unintuitive examples. If we think about decision-making, we can think about that as a state transition that needs to be carefully controlled. If we think about the first state as weighing options, criteria, and values, and then the second state as deciding on a course of action. Similarly, we can think about task switching as very simply starting with state 1, which is task XYZ, and then moving to state 2, which is task ABC. And lastly, we can think about behavioral inhibition as a state transition that needs to be carefully controlled when we think about state 1 being the urge to engage in a behavior and state 2 being the inhibition of the inappropriate behavior. So across these three simple examples, we see that state transitions and their careful control are necessary for cognitive control and executive function more broadly. But that leads me to ask the more general question, how do state transitions happen? And that is what I will focus on in the majority of this talk over the next few minutes. So to give you a simple outline for what we will do, we will begin by developing a theory for state transitions and their control. And I'll focus on a theoretical paper that we published in Nature Physics 2 years ago, but I will do very little of the math and really focus on the conceptual ideas and the theoretical framework. And then I will leave the details for you if you would like to look through the paper in more detail. And then I will move on to using that theory to probe normative development as well as psychosis spectrum symptoms. And in the third and last section of the talk, I will hone in on executive function specifically and its dysfunction in the context of schizophrenia. So to begin, I wanted to read this passage from Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he says, "Mind thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought in coming into contact with and thinking its objects, so that mind and object of thought are the same." And when I think about this passage, I think a lot about how the mind becomes. The mind is certainly matter, and it becomes matter in the sense of becoming similar to its objects. But how does mind actually do this becoming? I think that mind becomes as the brain represents objects, events, experiences, and concepts in the world around us. And when I think about representations, I'm thinking specifically about a pattern of activity across either neurons or neural units. And that particular pattern of activity represents something about the world. So in this particular case, we may have a representation relevant to this particular mushroom. We may have a different representation or pattern of activity that represents this other mushroom, and then again, different pattern of activity that represents the third mushroom. What's important about thinking about the brain as becoming and representing its objects is that this capacity to undergo state change, to move from one representation to another, is the process that provides flexible and actuatable function, both to a human mind and also to many other systems in biology. The challenge, though, in thinking about it in this way is that we need to understand the magic of state change. So how does one state actually transition into another? And we can make that question a little bit more concrete by asking, what features of neural systems constrain which of these transitions can happen and which transitions can't happen? Or what features of neural systems constrain which transitions are easy, or determine which transitions are easy and which transitions are difficult? So let's think about that a little bit more. In attempting to answer that question, I think we need to realize that understanding whether states are easy or difficult requires us to understand the architecture of the network underneath that state. So I'm going to start thinking about state and network pairs rather than states themselves. So in the top of this figure, you see a state where we have the first 3 neural units being active, the second 3 neural units being not particularly active, and then the last 4 units being, again, active. And I want to think of the pair of state and network, where the network underneath first has a triangle connecting these first 3 active units, then a line connecting the next 3 non-active units, and then a square connecting the last 4 active units. Now we know that active neurons, but also active neural units at the larger scale, can spread activity to other neurons or to other neural units around them. And having an active population is therefore easy if the neurons in that population are connected. If the neurons in that population are not connected, that makes it very difficult to activate the entire population. So what that means is that we can begin to think about pairs of states and networks that are easy to maintain, and then pairs that are difficult to maintain. Let's focus on the top left, just to ease the intuition here. So in the top left, we have the first 5 units activated and the second 5 units deactivated, and that state sits on top of a highly modular network where we have 5 units being densely interconnected, then just 1 line across and another 5 units being densely interconnected. This state and network pair is easy to maintain because all you have to do is activate one unit in the left-hand side, and it can spread that activity to all of the rest, but it has difficulty spreading the activity to the other module because there's only one very sparse bit of connectivity between these two modules. So this construction is relatively easy. Now I want to focus on two state network pairs that are more difficult, and again on the intuition side, before we get into putting some math behind it. So at the bottom left here, what you see is activation again of the first 5 units and deactivation of the second. But this state is very difficult to maintain on top of a network, which is the two modules but densely interdigitated with one another. When you have that dense connectivity between modules, then as soon as you activate this set, it shares that activity with the other set. And it's hard to separate them or segregate them, and meaning keeping these active and keeping these not active. So this is a difficult state network pair to maintain. Another difficult state network pair to maintain is what I'm showing you on the bottom right. So here we have activation of the first unit, deactivation of the second, activation, deactivation, activation, deactivation, etc. And we're trying to hold that state on top of a network that is highly modular. Now this is difficult because once a unit is active and attempts to share that information with the rest of the units in its module, the whole set becomes active instead of allowing for this very precise active-inactive pattern. So this state network pair is very difficult. And this notion of how the density and the topology of the network constraining the difficulty of states is also related to how it constrains the difficulty of state transitions. So I want to talk about two state transitions. Here on the top, we have activation of, again, the first 5 units and deactivation of the second. And the transition we want to enact is to take all of the units that were active in the first moment and deactivate them, and take all of the units that were deactivated in the first moment and activate them. So this is the transition that I'm showing pictorially in the top of this slide. Now, how would we do this? Well, we would do this by sending one inhibitory control signal into the left-hand module, and then one excitatory control signal into the right-hand module. And those two signals, those two fairly generic signals, can allow this state transition to happen. So I would call this state transition easy because it requires only two control signals. And I want to contrast that ease with the difficulty evident in the lower portion of this slide. So here we are showing a state network pair on the left-hand side, where we have, again, that sort of on-off state on top of a modular network. And what we want to do is to, again, flip all of the states. So anything that was inactive initially is now active on the right-hand side, again, on this modular network. To enact this state transition, we need to inject an inhibitory signal into the unit that was active, an excitatory signal into the unit that was not active, and precisely tune each one in order to allow this state transition to happen. So that requires many more control signals. It also requires very precise localization of those control signals. So when I'm saying that a state transition is easy versus hard, I'm speaking more precisely about the number and localization of control signals that are necessary to allow that state transition to happen. So with that intuition in mind, I'd like to put a little bit of formality behind it in the sense of a little bit of mathematics. Conceptually, what we've been doing is to say this notion that the network underneath of a activated system constrains which transitions are easy versus difficult is very related to what's called network control theory, which is an area of systems engineering that is typically used to understand robotic systems and technological systems, things like the power grid, for example. However, we've been realizing that these ideas are very relevant for understanding neural systems. And so in bringing these ideas over into neural systems, I've been working with Fabio Pasqualetti. Actually, we met when we were postdocs in UC Santa Barbara and have been collaborating as faculty ever since. And with him, we have written down a model for the dynamics of the brain that takes into account both the state and the network underneath. And that's this simple model here. So here's the state of the brain at time t+1. And then that is equal to the connectivity between brain regions. I'll focus the majority of my talk on the large-scale human brain, although these ideas have also been applied to non-human animals and to networks at the cellular scale. So here A is the adjacency matrix that indicates the connectivity of white matter tracks in the large-scale human brain. And then here is the x at time t, that's the state of the brain at time t. Then plus this term over here is the control. So U sub kappa is the control signal that's being injected at time t. B sub kappa is a matrix with ones along the diagonal typically, indicating which regions actually have the control signal being injected into them. And so with this model of the brain, we can say that the activity of the brain is flowing through the structural connections and can be modulated by control signals in other parts of the brain or from the external world. And with that model, we can move on to explicitly quantifying the ease and difficulty of state transitions. And I want to first focus your attention on the left-hand side of this slide to get a picture in your mind of what it is we're trying to do, and then I'll focus on the right-hand side and explain the cost function we use. So on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is an initial state of the brain with activation of motor cortex in this large blue swath here on the lateral surface of the brain. And naturally, according to intrinsic dynamics, that state may move along this gray trajectory on the left-hand side over to some grayscale state of the brain xt. And what we're interested in asking is not what is that intrinsic trajectory, but what control signals would be needed to move the brain to a different along a different trajectory to a different target state. In this case, the target state that we are interested in is the activation of primary visual cortex, as indicated by this purple swath, again on the lateral surface of the human brain. So if we're interested in this controlled trajectory, then what we can do is build on that simple model of network dynamics to write down a cost function for an optimal trajectory. And this cost function penalizes both the control energy, which is what I'm showing you here on the term on the right-hand side, so U sub kappa, but it also penalizes the distance of the state xt from the target state. So x of capital T is the target state and x is the current state, and we're trying to minimize that distance. That allows for a relatively straight rather than circuitous or meandering path from the initial state to the target state. And with this minimization, we can determine how much control input is needed and into which regions must it be injected in order to allow for this optimal control trajectory to occur. With these techniques, we can begin to ask and answer several different complementary questions. And I wanted to focus on work that was led by trainees in the lab over the last couple years, but I will also note that there are several other labs that are using these techniques at the moment, both in the human and in non-human neural circuits. So we can ask questions such as which brain states require least energy to go towards, or we can ask how much energy does it take to activate a particular cognitive circuit, and are some cognitive circuits more costly to activate than others? Are the brain networks of some species easier to control than others? Could individual energetics be used to personalize brain stimulation? Do these energetics explain individual differences in brain-computer interface learning? And more generally, how do I use these methods to ask my own questions about my own data? But even apart from those specific questions that we can ask, the underlying structure of the approach is to state that each state change has an associated energy cost, and the network architecture of neural systems constrains which of these transitions are easy, requiring a small change in energy, versus which transitions are more difficult, requiring a large change in energy. And so with this conceptual and mathematical approach in your mind, I do want to then move on to the second portion of my talk, which is to use this theory to probe normative development and psychosis spectrum symptoms. So I'll begin this section by asking what sorts of transitions are important for a brain? And I think if you ask yourself this question and stop even for a moment to think of what the answer is, you'll realize that the brain has many different transitions that it must enact. So perhaps it's sort of a little bit naive to ask which transition, but maybe what we want to do is to ask which kinds of transitions, which sort of sets of transitions are important for a brain. And so that's where we started a lot of this work, is probing whole sets of transitions that are of one kind or another. And in the systems engineering literature, these sets of transitions are really referred to as strategies of control. So two of the common strategies for control that are used in that literature and that I think are very relevant for thinking about the brain are at the average control strategy and the modal control strategy. So to define these, we're going to stay with this simple model, linear model of network dynamics that I've written before. And then we're also going to write down the T-steps controllability Gramian, which is, as you can see, a function of both the adjacency matrix, so the structural connectivity between brain regions, and the B matrix, which indicates which units have energy being injected into them. So the average controllability is then defined simply as the trace of the inverse of the Gramian and gives you an intuition or an estimate of the energy required to move, or the ease of moving among many of the states available on the current energy landscape of the system. And I want to contrast that with the modal controllability, which is a separate strategy, which provides an estimate of how easy it is for a region to drive the system to a state far away on the energy landscape. So the modal controllability is really preferentially about these distant transitions, whereas the average controllability is more about the sort of average transition on the landscape. The modal controllability is defined from the adjacency matrix, so the structural connectivity between brain regions. So if we simply let Vj be the jth eigenvector of A with a particular eigenvalue lambda j, then if the element Vij is small, that means that the jth mode of this system is poorly controllable from node I. And that allows us to define a scaled measure across all regions, so phi I. This is a scaled measure of controllability of all n modes of the system. You can see that we're summing from j equals 1 to n from region I. So with these two metrics, we can begin to ask the question of which regions of the brain may be most structurally predisposed, given their pattern of white matter connectivity, to enact certain kinds of control strategies or allow certain types of state transitions. And so this is work that was led by Shigu when he was a graduate student in the lab, and he now runs his own lab in China. And what he was interested in is to ask which regions of the brain display different types of control strategies or have the structural predispositions to do so. And he focused on two systems specifically. So the default mode system, which is highlighted in the blue color on the lateral and medial surfaces of the human brain. And this is a system, a set of regions that is very active when a human is resting, not doing anything particular inside of a scanner. And what he found is that those regions have very high levels of average controllability, so abbreviated as AC in this graph, and low levels of modal controllability. And what does that mean? That means that regions that are active at rest show white matter connectivity patterns that are predicted to effectively allow those regions to drive the brain to nearby states. And I want to contrast what we see in this default mode with what we see in frontal parietal regions, which are implicated and active in cognitive control processes and tasks that require executive function. So these regions are highlighted in green, again on the lateral and medial surfaces of the brain. And Shigu found that these regions have very high levels of modal controllability and lower levels of average controllability. So what does this mean? This means that regions in the frontal parietal system, which we know are implicated in transient control processes, are high in modal controllability and therefore are structurally predisposed to be able to effectively push the brain to difficult to reach states. And this is very intuitive when we think about cognitive control as the careful control of state transitions, as we sort of mentioned at the opening of this talk. So these preferences for these regions are consistent with our notions of what these regions do for us in human cognition. But we wanted to press a little bit further and to ask, is network control relevant for how we think about cognitive control? Yes, in the sense that it is preferentially located in certain parts of the brain, but we also wanted to ask whether we could see evidence for this relationship as cognitive control develops. So in the human, between the ages of 8 and about 25 years of age, executive function is changing significantly. And in fact, under most accounts, adult levels of cognitive control have not been reached until the person is about 25. So what we did in this study, which was led by Evelyn Tang and done in collaboration with Ted Satterthwaite, as well as Ruben and Raquel Gurr and many others at the Brain Behavior Laboratory here at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Psychiatry, we asked the question of how network control changes as individual youth develop. So here what you see is the amount of modal controllability in each subject along the y-axis and the amount of average controllability along the x-axis. Every data point is a youth in the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort, and their ages range from 8 to 22. The first thing I want you to note from this figure is that average and modal controllability are strongly positively correlated with one another. What that means is that the brain that has strong or high average controllability also has high modal controllability. So the brain that is able to enact one kind of transition is also able to better enact the other type of transition. We do not see a trade-off between these two control strategies in human development. We see them aligning with one another. I also want you to notice that both types of control are greater than expected in two null models. So in this yellowish color, we have a null model that preserves the strength or sum of connectivity from each region. And in the peach, we have a null model that preserves the nodal degree or the number of connections coming out of each region. Now, the next question is are those controllability values changing in line with age? And so this is the exact same data, simply replotted such that each data point has a color associated with it, and that color indicates the age of the individual, with bright yellow meaning showing the 22-year-olds and the dark blues showing the 8-year-olds. And so what you can see is that there's a strong relationship between age and controllability, where individuals who are older, the 22-year-olds, tend to have high values of both average and modal controllability, suggesting that both strategies are accessible to them with ease, whereas the 8-year-olds have low levels of modal and average controllability, suggesting that those two strategies are less accessible to the 8-year-olds. So that's interesting. It suggests that network control is related to is strengthening over the same developmental time period as executive control is changing. So we have pressed this line of inquiry with several additional papers that collectively suggest that network control partially explains cognitive control. So in Evelyn Tang's work, we showed that network controllability increases throughout development when cognitive control is also increasing. And in Shigu's paper, we showed that network controllability varies across regions, with modal control being particularly high in cognitive control areas. But another important piece of evidence came from Eli Kornblath. He was an MD PhD student in the lab, and he showed in his study that individual differences in network controllability correlate with a false positive rate on a continuous performance task, which is a common measure of impulsivity. And so this provides a sort of deeper and richer account of network controllability being related to the control of behavior. So together, these results suggest that our theory is a useful marker of cognitive control, and specifically how the brain enacts control to change network function. But we can ask the question, what actually drives controllability? I've mentioned that it differs across different people, that individual differences matter, that it changes throughout development, but what is it that really drives these differences? Well, there are both local circuit drivers and non-local circuit drivers that account for the controllability estimates that I've been showing you. So the local circuit drivers are that regions that have many connections tend to have high average controllability and low modal controllability. Regions whose connections span from strong to weak also tend to have high average controllability. So those are quantities about the very local circuitry around a region, just its immediate connections. But there are also some non-local circuit drivers. So regions whose neighbors have these properties of many connections and a variety of strong and weak are also tend to have higher values of average controllability. So it's important to account for both the local and the non-local circuit drivers for these estimates and understanding their role in the control of state transitions. And this difference is something that Lyndon Parks in the lab was really interested in. He's currently a postdoc, and he really wanted to unpack where the local circuit drivers mattered more for controllability and where the non-local circuit drivers mattered more for controllability. So what he did was that he studied brain regions on a continuum from unimodal cortex in the dark purples here to transmodal cortex in the bright yellows. And he wanted to see, well, where is the controllability, specifically the average controllability, simply explained by local circuitry, as estimated by the strength or sum of connection weights coming out of an area, and where was it really accounting for something else, something more about the complexity of the broader circuitry around that region. And so here what you see is the correlation between the strength, or a local circuit measure, and the average controllability as a function of this gradient from unimodal cortex to transmodal cortex. And what you can see is that in unimodal cortex, the average controllability is very well predicted by just the connections coming out of the region. Whereas once you've moved over into transmodal cortex, the controllability of those areas really does not depend significantly on the local connectivity, but requires explanations from the global circuitry. So this data suggests that transmodal areas have more complex local connectivity environments that drive unexpected control properties. And he was particularly interested in these transmodal areas because they are also implicated in the processes of psychosis, and differences in connectivity and activation that are in those areas relate to psychosis spectrum symptoms. So what he did then in the next portion of this study is to ask whether he could predict psychosis positive symptoms from average controllability versus from a local measure like strength. To do this, he built a prediction model where X, let's say average controllability, was used to predict Y, which in this case was psychosis positive symptoms, after controlling for age, sex, brain volume, and in-scanner motion. He used 100 repeats of tenfold cross-validation, with each repeat using a different random split of the data. And so here you see the root mean squared error, lower is better here. And along the x-axis is unimodal to transmodal areas. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the prediction of psychosis positive symptoms from average controllability. And on the right-hand side, you are seeing the prediction simply from strength. And what you can see is that there's a strong relationship between the prediction accuracy and the location on this unimodal transmodal gradient, where transmodal areas have average controllability values that significantly predict psychosis positive symptoms. And as that prediction capacity becomes weaker and weaker and weaker as you move to unimodal cortex. And you do not see a significant prediction of psychosis positive symptoms from simply strength. So what this suggests is that there's something special about the network controllability in transmodal cortex, which is significantly predictive of psychosis spectrum symptoms, accounting for these more global circuit drivers. Now, with that, I'd like to move to the last section of my talk, where I would like to focus in more specifically on executive function and its dysfunction. So far, we've spoken a little bit more generally about strategies of control or sets of state transitions, and broadly about development and psychosis positive symptoms. But I want to narrow in now to executive function specifically and its dysfunction in schizophrenia. So to motivate this section, I want to ask what transitions are important, not for the brain at large, but for executive function very specifically. And I want to ask the question, if there is a state transition that is relevant for executive function, what might that state transition be if we had to boil it all down to one transition? And this is work that was led by Xiaozhu Qiu, who was a postdoc with Ted Satterthwaite. And I was lucky enough to be a collaborator on this project. And it's so exciting that I wanted to highlight it for you here today. So what Xiaozhu was interested in is the specific state transition from a baseline initial state to activation of frontal parietal areas, which again are important for cognitive control and executive function. So he wants to ask, how does this specific state transition happen? Where does energy need to be injected into the brain? How much energy needs to be injected into the brain? Why? Is it different across subjects, etc.? He focused in answering these questions on, again, the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort, where he had 946 youth between the ages of 8 and 22 years of age. And by setting up the problem in this way, he was able to isolate the effect of activating frontal parietal circuitry. But he also, because he used individual maps of white matter connectivity, we were able to understand subject-specific energies required for this state transition. So his first question was, does the energy required to activate the frontal parietal system change with age? And might that allow for the ease of cognitive control in the 22-year-olds? So here what you see along the y-axis is the control energy, and then along the x-axis is the age in years. And you can see a significant negative correlation here, where the individuals who are older tend to require less control energy to activate the frontal parietal system than individuals who are younger. So this is interesting because the older youth are also those whose executive function is higher. So it's suggestive of the fact that the lower control energy used or needed by these individuals may allow for that executive function to flourish. So this evidence supports, but does not prove yet, that the white matter network develops in a particular way to ease the transition to executive function, thus facilitating the frequent use of this cognitive process in older youth. But Xiaozhu then was interested in asking, if we remove the effects of age, can we better understand individual differences in executive function at the particular age where those individuals exist? So what he did was that he regressed out the effects of age and looked at the residuals. And he asked the question of whether the control energy required for this state transition is related to individual differences in executive performance. And for executive performance, we used a 2-hour cognitive battery. It's called the Penn Computerized Neurocognitive Battery. And then we applied a factor analysis to these data to extract one factor where there were loadings from multiple tasks that required executive function and cognitive control. And what Xiaozhu found is that there's a negative relationship between the control energy and the executive performance, indicating that those who performed best or had the best executive function were also those who required less energy to activate the frontal parietal system. Interestingly, he also found that control energy in this bilateral middle cingulate area mediates the relationship between age and executive function, helping us to better understand how executive function is changing with age, but is also influenced by the white matter organization of an individual, particularly around this region. So that leads me to the question of, if cognitive control and executive function is being supported by lower control energies, that helps us to understand how the brain moves to a particular state, activating these regions that are important for executive function. However, if we think about it, the optimal performance of tasks requiring cognitive control and executive function require not just a state transition, but often also require holding a state for a period of time. So we can think about both a state transition and state maintenance as requiring energy. To persist in a particular state requires energy if that state is not an energy minimum on the accessible landscape. And so this distinction between a state transition and state persistence is one that Urs Braun was very interested in probing in the context of executive function. He was at the time a visiting scholar in the lab and is now leading his own group in the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim, Germany. And he decided to evaluate this question of state transitions and persistence in the context of a working memory task. And this working memory task had both a series of zero-back trials, which require focused attention, and a series of two-back trials, which required recalling the item or stimulus that occurred two stimuli back in a stream. And so he asked the question of how much control energy is required to transition from an attention state, that zero-back state, to the working memory state, and how much energy is required to persistently hold either of these states. The reason he was interested in this is that precise control of both the state transitions and state persistence is required for optimal performance on this task, including both the task accuracy and speed. This was also work that was done in collaboration with Heike Toast and Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg, and just came out in Nature Communications this year, a couple weeks ago. And so the initial piece of data that Urs found is the amount of control energy, or estimated, was the amount of control energy as people move from the zero-back task to the two-back task. So what he did is that he defined the zero-back state to be the beta weights of a general linear model on the fMRI task data. And similarly with the two-back was given by beta weights on the GLM. And so what he can say is how much energy is required to move from that state of the zero-back to the state of the two-back using the underlying structural connectivity of these individuals. What he found is that the control energy moving from the zero-back state to the two-back state was much higher than the control energy required to move from the two-back state to the zero-back state. And what I think is really interesting about this result is that it's consistent with how we think about the cognitive demands or the cognitive load of this task. So transitioning into the cognitively more demanding state required more control energy than the opposite transition. Then he moved on to asking about what is the persistence? How much energy is required to persist in the zero-back state and to persist in the two-back state? And along the y-axis here, you see a stability measure, which is just the inverse of the control energy. So the stability of the zero-back state was higher than the stability of the two-back state. And what that means is that the zero-back state requires less energy to hold than the two-back state. This is again interesting because it is consistent with our notion of the cognitive load of these two tasks, the zero-back state being easier and the two-back state being more difficult. What we also found was interesting is that the cognitively demanding two-back state showed a lot of individual variation, as did the zero-back state, but the individual variation in the two-back state was associated with individual differences in task accuracy, with greater stability of the two-back state in an individual being associated with higher task accuracy. Now, in the last portion of this study, Urs asked the question of whether the control energy and its variation in an executive function task is related to dopaminergic signaling. And this is because there's been some really interesting work, theoretical work on the two-state dopamine theory of working memory function, different kinds of dopamine transmitters being relevant for either moving on the energy landscape or altering the nature of the energy landscape. And so what he did to probe the potential role of dopaminergic signaling in these findings is to use a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind pharma fMRI study where individuals were given either placebo, which is in this dark blue color, or amisulpride, which is in the lighter blue color. Amisulpride is a selective D2 antagonist. And what he found is that the control energy for both of these transitions, from 0 back to 2 back and from 2 back to 0 back, was increased on amisulpride compared to placebo. So that is certainly indicative of a role for dopaminergic signaling in the nature of the energy landscape on which the brain is moving. And then in the last portion of this study, he wanted to ask, well, if the control energy is related to dopaminergic signaling, then patients who have dopaminergic abnormalities should show alterations in the control energy. And so he decided to study a group of patients with schizophrenia who we know have marked dopaminergic abnormalities, but also deficits in executive function, as well as alterations in structural connectivity. And so here on the right-hand side, you see the control energy estimated for healthy individuals versus patients with schizophrenia. The patients with schizophrenia are in the dark blue, and the healthy controls are in the lighter blue. And what was found is that more control energy is needed for the patients with schizophrenia when they are transitioning from the 0 back to the 2 back, so from the less cognitively demanding state to the more cognitively demanding state, but not vice versa. So this is, again, supporting the notion that network control energy is modulated by dopaminergic function and relevant for the performance of executive function tasks and individual differences in that performance. So just to now broaden back out over what we did this morning in the East Coast, or maybe this night or afternoon for you, wherever you are listening from, is that we began by developing a theory for state transitions and their control. And then we used that theory to probe normative development and the psychosis spectrum symptoms in individuals who are between the ages of 8 and 22. In the last section of the talk, we used that theory then to probe executive function more specifically and the state transitions necessary for it, as well as its dysfunction in patients with schizophrenia. But if you don't remember any of the details of the talk, there is one very simple take-home message, which is that the network architecture of neural systems constrains which of these transitions are easy, requiring a small change in energy, versus which transitions are hard, requiring a large change in energy, with relevance for development, as we saw in section 2, as well as for disease and drug, as we saw in section 3. And so with that, I'd like to obviously acknowledge the people in the lab, as well as the funding that has supported the work. I tried to specifically highlight the individuals who led the work and are key collaborators as we went through, but the work is certainly the effort of many individuals who I did not have time to mention. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I would be very happy to take a few questions, perhaps, if we have time.
Great. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Very, very interesting. If I could ask a question to start off with. So you present, your idea is that control energy is something that varies a ton, and that network controllability is fixed. Do you see a potential for network controllability itself to be plastic? And might that vary between states of mania and normal behavior in a schizophrenia context, for instance?
Yes, this is such a great question. Thank you for asking. Yes, so in the work that I've shown you today, we are estimating the controllability from the structural connectivity, which suggests that the landscape is relatively fixed because the structural connectivity is relatively fixed. However, there's very strong evidence in the computational neuroscience literature and neuroscience literature in general to suggest that patterns of information flow or signaling across the network can vary depending on kind of the context, the broader state of the brain, or cognitive state or mood state. And so we've been pushing in the last few years to move beyond the structural connectivity and instead use estimates of effective connectivity, so which connections are actually being used at this moment. And in that case, then you have one matrix for the connectivity that's relevant now, another matrix that may be relevant for the connectivity in 10 minutes from now, and another matrix for 10 minutes after that. And we've used that particularly in the context of epilepsy as we understand the patterns of signal flow during a seizure. So we've estimated effective connectivity early in the seizure, middle in the seizure, and late in the seizure, and then asked what are the control profiles of those three sort of broader states. That work was just published in PNAS a couple of months ago. So yes, great question. We've only used that idea really in the context of epilepsy so far, but I think that it's relevant much more broadly.
Great. Thanks so much. Let's see, we have some questions. One from Martin Zeptagi, so I'll see if I can find him and ask him whether he'd like to be whether he'd like to come on screen. There. Issue an invitation. It takes a second to check. Martin says no, he'd prefer not to. It's early in the morning for a lot of people. But he did ask a great question, I thought. Are there quantitative estimates of how the control energy cost relates to the metabolic energy usage in the network? Is there a simple relationship in general?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And we are working on a study right now where we have linked the control energy that is used in particular areas with metabolic usage as estimated with PET imaging. And so that work is exciting, I think, because it provides a connection between this theoretical notion of energy and an actual more biophysical notion of energy in the form of metabolism. But that work is not yet on a preprint server, but hopefully will be by the end of the summer. So that's coming shortly. But I do think that that's a really great and important question because it's always relevant. It's always the energy that we are using is sort of in arbitrary units, and even the time that we are using is in arbitrary units. And so while that allows flexibility in applying the techniques to different time scales and to different energy kinds across different systems from the power grid to the brain, it also begs the question of when you use it, is it related to the time scales and energies units that are relevant for that system? So great question. We are working on at least one indication that there's a really nice relationship, but I think more could be done.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a couple questions on linearity in the model. So one person asked, why do you prefer a little linear model? And then one of the highly rated questions is, are there attempts to include nonlinearities in at least the neuronal dynamics?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we focus initially on the linear results because we really like to do analytic work too, and so the equations are much more amenable to analytic work if in the nonlinear space than in the linear space than in the nonlinear space. So that's one reason to sort of gather intuition from the mathematics. The linear model is very relevant, obviously, even for nonlinear systems, as long as you're in the vicinity of the operating point. So you can always linearize around where the system is currently sitting. If we start thinking about movements that may require us to move to go far from an operating point, then you can ask the question of, should we include nonlinearities in the dynamics? And if so, is it in the activation or is it in a change in the connectivity? So having the A matrix be A of T, a time varying A, instead of just a static A. And so our first efforts so far are in including the nonlinearities as a varying A. And that's the study in epilepsy that I just mentioned. But there is also some work in the network control field in engineering that is using nonlinear dynamics, where they put the nonlinearity, more in the activity. I think that there's room for both in the future going forward.
Sounds interesting and promising. So our next question is from Jun-Young Kim. I understand the control energy is defined as the energy that's required to drive a state transition. Also, the state transition is related to what node was activated. And so she asks then, how can we define control energy as a constant? Is it related to node properties like degree, betweenness, centrality?
So control energy is it is how much energy needed to be injected into the system in the simulation, and to which regions to allow for you to move from a given state of activity to another state of activity. And the assumption is that it is, well, not the assumption, the explicit statement of the mathematics is that the activity is moving along the structural connections, or the effective connections in this newer work. And so what that means is that it is not related to the degree or the betweenness centrality, in the sense that those are statistics of the graph independent of a model of flow of activity. So there can be, although there can be statistical relationships, what is explicitly in this formulation, which is not in graph theory, is a model of dynamics. And so I think that that's important, because it is stipulating a mechanism of signal transmission. And that mechanism of signal transmission then can be extended and made richer by including more biophysics as needed, and then you can increasingly arrive at more complex dynamics, which obviously dynamics are not at all in graph theory. So I hope that's helpful as a distinction.
That draws a few distinctions for sure. So I think we'll use this as the last question, since it's about time. Chris Metzner asks, your approach draws conclusions from the large-scale anatomy. How would you incorporate the influences of local microcircuit properties? As we, for example, now that there are altered in, those things might be altered in schizophrenic disorders.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's some very nice work by, I think, Singleton et al. On bioRxiv, which takes into account local variation in neurotransmitter levels and incorporates them into the B matrix that I described, so into the actual control formulation. And that allows for regional variation, not in microcircuitry, but certainly in microphysiology, which can provide for a better understanding of how state transitions may be modulated by these very local features. So I think that's a neat new direction that the work has taken. It's from another lab, not ours. I also would mention that there is work in C. elegans, so in microcircuitry, and that's published in, I want to say, 2017 in Nature, maybe. So it is being used at that scale too.
Great. Thank you so much for all of your questions and for your answers. So I think we need to close the session here. I'd like to remind the watchers that Anka has told me that you can still ask questions from Crowdcast once we're even after we're live, so we can still pose questions that we can answer later today. All right. All right. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and a really
Thank you.
informative and thoughtful session.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll see you later today for a question answer. All right. Thanks again.